After Saratoga, Israel and his unit were heading to Rutland to await the next alarm. Winter was coming and it was best for the militia units to weather it at home. On the other hand, the colonial army would enter their winter quarters at Valley Forge less than 3 months later. But the war was not over, and would grind on for 5 more years. There would be more fighting to come, but many of the battles were far from Rutland and didn't involve Israel and his kin. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed on September 3, 1783, and the United States of America was officially born. But even the home front was hard on the civilian population during the conflict. The war had disrupted commerce throughout the colonies, and much of what was produced, food, cloth, tools, was diverted to support General Washington's army. Daily life became a struggle, as shortages and inflation took their toll. So until the war's end, Israel, his family, and their neighbors in Rutland had no choice but to endure. They faced the constant strain of doing more with less, of holding on to hope while uncertainty loomed over every season. But once the British troops were gone, then what? What came next for men like Israel, who had fought for independence, and for communities like Rutland, which had weathered the cost of war? With the war finally over and independence won, the people of Rutland looked toward the future, but peace did not come with instant prosperity. The British were gone, but they left behind a nation in economic disarray. The new United States had no national currency worth trusting, war debts loomed large, and trade was slow to recover. For Israel, the return to civilian life meant picking up the plow again. He, like many veterans, came home to farms that had been neglected during years of war. Fences had fallen, fields had gone to seed, and families had stretched every resource thin just to survive. The promise of liberty was real, but so were the hardships that came with building a new nation from the ground up. Some veterans were granted land in the West, places like upstate New York or the newly opened lands in what would become Vermont or Kentucky. For others, land grants never came, or came too late. Still, the hope of owning and cultivating land kept many going. There was a strong belief that hard work and sacrifice would be rewarded in this new republic. In Rutland, the community pulled together. They rebuilt barns, replanted fields, and reopened town meetings, not under a royal governor's rule, but as free citizens of a republic. The questions that lay ahead were daunting. How should the new government work? What rights should people have? Could 13 different colonies really become one united country? For Israel and his neighbors, the answers would come slowly, shaped not only by debates in Philadelphia, but by the steady rhythm of rural life, by harvests and town votes, by weddings and funerals, by the determination to give their children something better than war and struggle. In the years following the Revolutionary War, the newly independent United States faced a major challenge: how to settle and govern the vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, land ceded by Britain in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. This region, known as the Northwest Territory, included what would become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Among those eyeing this new frontier were Revolutionary War veterans, many of whom had been paid for their service with land warrants instead of hard money, essentially promises of land rather than cash, due to the financial crisis facing the young nation. One such veteran was Rufus Putnam, a general in the Continental Army, an engineer and trusted friend of George Washington. Recognizing the potential to rewarding veterans and at the same time promoting orderly settlement of the frontier, Putnam helped found the Ohio Company of Associates in 1786. The company was a group of New England veterans and investors, primarily from Massachusetts, who organized to purchase and settle land in the Northwest Territory. Their goals were both patriotic and practical: to expand the United States, establish civilized communities, and create economic opportunity. In response, the company helped pass the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, a groundbreaking piece of legislation that banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, guaranteed civil liberties such as freedom of religion and trial by jury, and set up the process for how new states could be formed. In April 1788, Putnam led a group of 48 settlers down the Ohio River to establish the first permanent U.S. settlement in the Northwest Territory, called Marietta, Ohio. It was named in honor of Queen Marie Antoinette of France, thus recognizing French support during the Revolution. The town was carefully laid out with fortified areas to protect against potential Native American resistance. The land was still considered by the Native Americans to belong to them. Upon landing, the men immediately unloaded their axes, shovels, and barrels of supplies, and before nightfall the ring of steel on timber echoed through the forests. They began raising defenses immediately, a necessity in a land still claimed by powerful native confederacies and shadowed by British garrisons farther north. They called their fortified settlement Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, a reminder that this was both a home and a stronghold. Within weeks, the outlines of a town appeared. Streets were laid out in New England style, wide enough for wagons, with lots reserved for schools, churches, and public commons. Children laughed as they played among the stumps of freshly felled trees, while women kindled the cooking fires near crude cabins. Sentries were posted, but hope was stronger than fear. The settlers were so excited as they pitched in to build the new home. Most were Revolutionary War veterans whose back pay was non-existent. But now they had a real home and a future for their families. They all knew that the war was over and the battles were won, but now the hardest work remained: picking up the pieces, mourning the lost, caring for the wounded, rebuilding lives and farms and futures. They had come to realize that wars might end with treaties, but for families, the recovery would stretch for years to come, sometimes generations. But now that was all behind them, and each family to start anew. As word spread of the success of the first group of immigrants in Marietta, Israel and Lydia decided to take Putnam up on his gracious offer as well. To pay off their debts before departure, they were forced to sell their Rutland farm on Muscapauge Pond in 1786. Then, they decided that Israel would make the journey first before Lydia, and the children joined him. So, first things first. They moved to the old King farm and leased it for 3 years, but the soil turned out to be so poor and worn out. So, in February 1789, they left King's farm for land elsewhere, while his oldest son, Sardine, hired himself out for extra money. Most of the other children went to homes of other families until they could all come together again in Ohio. The following spring, after Marietta's founding, Israel's group of Ohio Company settlers poled their flatboats down the Ohio River, their eyes drawn to a wide, open plain on the north bank. Unlike the thick forests that hemmed in Marietta, here the land rolled back from the river in open fields fringed with groves of walnut and sycamore. The French had called the spot Belle Prairie, or Beautiful Meadow, and the name Belpreux stuck. The broad prairie promised fertile soil for corn, wheat, and orchards, and the river offered both protection and a ready highway to markets downstream. Families who had braved the wilderness with children in tow longed for farmland that could be tilled without endless years of clearing timber. Here they would stake their claims. Just imagine a 40-year-old Israel accompanying this caravan in the dead of winter. Supposedly he had set off in a pung, which was a box-shaped sleigh pulled by a single horse over snow and ice, which was all he needed traveling without his family. His journey was not only heroic, but downright foolhardy. But he wasn't chasing adventure, he was doing what was necessary to give his children a future. After a long, arduous journey, he and his comrades arrived in April 1789 and began work immediately. The Ohio Company directors even provided Israel with a loan of $20 to help him get started on his new venture. But, shortly after Israel stepped off the flatboat, he heard the story of Captain Zebulon King, who was shot and scalped by 2 Indians on April 30, 1789. King had been chopping wood on his land when the Indians attacked and killed him. The news of Captain King certainly gave Israel pause about bringing his family to Ohio, but their financial situation forced his hand. Plus, he had grown up on stories of Indian depredations back home in Rutland, so he was determined to see this venture through one way or another. The flatboats used by the company had to be big enough to take the settlers, their families, their belongings and their livestock. It was a precarious journey to say the least. One of Putnam's travelers who had made the trip with Israel was Major Nathan Goodale, a distinguished soldier and former officer in Putnam's regiment during the Revolutionary War. His combat experience along with the other veterans gave Israel a sense of security should any Indians come their way. Nathan was also a renowned expert on cattle and declined to use horses or oxen for his wagon team. Instead, he used cattle. Nathan chose 3 of his best and 1 of his finest bulls, and trained them to work as a team. They not only were excellent at pulling his wagon, but also provided milk during the entire trip. The offspring of these 4 animals spread throughout the Ohio community and were known as the Goodale breed. Not only was he famous for his farming techniques, but he was also appointed to manage the settlement's safety concerns. A cousin of Israel's on the same trip with he and Nathan was Jonathan Stone from Braintree, Massachusetts. He would eventually marry Susanna Matthews, the niece of his old commanding officer and mentor General Rufus Putnam. In 1775, he would march to Cambridge with the Braintree Minutemen on the Lexington Alarm. By 1777, he was a captain in General Rufus Putnam's Continental Regiment and would retire from the Army in January 1783. After his retirement, he was called back to duty at the onset of Shays' Rebellion that same year. He was ordered to march his militia company to Springfield and guard the arsenal there. The crux of the rebellion was the increased taxes and confiscation of property for non-payment by the government, so similar to what the veterans had just fought Britain for the same thing. The 4,000 protesters marched to Springfield to capture the weapons, but were opposed by Jonathan and the other militia troops. When the rebellion was over, Jonathan left Brookfield, Massachusetts on July 4, 1789, and began his sojourn to Belpro, Ohio, with the rest of his party. By a twist of fate, opposing him from Shays' forces was his older brother Francis Stone on the other side of the battle line. Brother against brother. Not long after his arrival in Belpro, Jonathan was thrown into the chaos of the Indian uprising and he and his family were forced to move into one of the blockhouses. He was eventually nominated for the position of treasurer in 1792 and occupied this position until his death in 1801. In 1799, he would build the home now known as the Stone House that still stands today. It was in August of 1789 that Israel's son Jasper arrived from Rutland, after accompanying the family of Captain William Dana, a veteran of Bunker Hill. Jasper was sent to assist his father in clearing the land and building their cabin. Israel's oldest daughter, Elizabeth, would also arrive that same year with their Rutland neighbors, Lieutenant Benjamin Miles, formerly of the Continental Army, along with his family. Miles also brought some choice cattle, including a pair of very large oxen, but the Indians later killed them. Luckily, after Captain King's death, things eventually settled down once again. However, General Putnam still warned residents to stay close to the settlement in case of any more Indian attacks, particularly those living on donation lands farther away from any protection. Heeding Putnam's warning, Israel decided to postpone any improvements to his land until the danger had passed. But no sooner had one crisis lessened than another rose to threaten the settlement. In January 1790, a flatboat had arrived in Marietta with a Mr. Welsh aboard. As it turned out, he was sick with smallpox. He was taken to the home of James and Mary Garner Owen and treated before they knew what he had. In response, the residents built a pest house near where Marietta College stands today. Welsh was quarantined there but died a few days later. In response, some residents chose to move over to Belpro to escape this possible epidemic. But thankfully the epidemic did not occur, but would re-emerge in September 1793 in nearby Belpro. In the meantime, the town was struck with periodic Indian attacks and even scarlet fever before smallpox returned in 1793. This time it was brought to their doorstep by a scout named Benjamin Patterson, even though he had already been inoculated in Marietta. In response, the Belpro community initiated drastic measures by inoculating the entire community at Farmers Castle, which had become one great hospital. Luckily, the immunization effort protected the community from devastation. About 100 were inoculated, and all but 5 survived. Again, Israel was no stranger to this calamity as well. As a small boy in 1760, a young soldier had come through Rutland and brought the smallpox with him. Sadly, Israel's cousin Patience Stone, wife of Samuel Stone of Rutland, had succumbed to its ravages along with 6 others. And if it wasn't Indians or smallpox, it was diphtheria. In 1749, the year of Israel's birth, the nearby town of Northborough, Massachusetts, had been struck with an epidemic of the dreaded disease. Of the 300 inhabitants, 60 children paid the price and died of the malady. Many of the families were forced to bury all their children within days of each other. This is the world that Israel and Lydia had grown up in. Then came the joyous day in November 1790, when they announced that flatboats could be seen coming down the river. People gathered in excitement on the river's shore to see who was coming, what news did they have, and what supplies were on their crowded desks. As it turned out, it was Lydia on the deck waving to Israel and Jasper, who were waving back from the shoreline. General Putnam had brought his own family on this perilous trip that was finally finished. It had taken months to cross 800 miles of rough terrain, carrying not just supplies but hope, and finally uniting their family in their new home. Their story had everything: hardship, perseverance, adventure, hope, and family at the center of it all. The caravan had started out making the trip by covered wagons before boarding the flatboats on the Ohio River. Even the children were given the chores of keeping the livestock fed and watered. The flatboats were constructed to follow the river's current, but could be guided by a rudder, or at times could be paddled with long oars. Their journey had been long and grueling, but our ancestors were among the toughest pioneers you could imagine. Driven by a single, unwavering goal, to build a better life for their children, they faced each day with a sense of true grit and determination. Clearing the land by hand, carving fields from virgin forest, and enduring the harsh realities of frontier life became their daily companions. It was hard work, but it was familiar work. And now, for the first time, they had a real chance to create something of their own that would be lasting, rooted in sacrifice and hope. Israel's newly arrived family and fellow travelers would gather at their homes to tell the tale of their great adventure. Their son Sardine had led the family caravan across rough country, first by ox cart, then floating down the rivers in the flatboats, a classic American frontier journey if there ever was one. General Putnam's family was in this latter caravan with his wife, Persis, and 8 children and his domestics. Also, his 2 daughters had married and attached their destiny to their parents. Susanna brought her husband from Rutland, Ensign Christopher Burlingame, while Abigail came along with her husband, Lieutenant William Browning. In all, it is said there were over 50 souls in Lydia's caravan. After the stories were all told and retold, Lydia could see what Israel had accomplished in her absence. She realized her husband's wisdom by choosing to settle in Belpre, which encompassed 6 miles of level bottom land along the fertile Ohio River. She could also see that this land would become the richest farmland in the new territories. Luckily, when Israel first arrived, he had been given his first opportunity to reverse their financial misfortune. Putnam had contracted with him to begin clearing land at Belpre for $8 a day plus the right to occupy it for 3 years after it was cleared. But it had been from sunrise to sunset work, brutal and exhausting. But the work of building a log cabin by hand with only Jasper's help, then clearing the land for Putnam with nothing but muscle and willpower, is something straight out of a pioneer legend, because it was. But the family was now reunited and they had survived the arduous journey without tragedy or mishap, so Lydia was content with her new life. But just 6 weeks after her arrival, her life was shattered beyond belief. On the evening of January 2, 1791, Israel was notified by a runner that the Indians were attacking the settlement. A family had been massacred some miles up the Muskingum River at Big Bottom. 9 men, 1 woman, and 2 children had been killed and scalped with only 3 survivors, among them a boy who escaped by hiding under blankets in the corner of the cabin as his family was slaughtered. Israel immediately prepared for an attack as his 2 sons, Sardine and Jasper, stood watch with their rifles in hand that night. Comically, Lydia refused to let her children undress for bed, insisting, "If anyone escapes tonight, they will not be seen half naked." The attack was without warning and extremely bloody, as the warriors looked for more victims. One of the causes of the Indian Wars was that the settlements sat right on the edge of their contested lands. The 1780s and 1790s were the height of what's often called the Northwest Indian War, when a confederation of Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, Mingo, and Miami warriors fought back fiercely against the American expansion into the Ohio Valley. Agreements and treaties made in Washington were of no binding interest to them. The depredations around Belpre were severe in the sense of constant danger, scattered killings, and disrupted farming life, but thanks to the defensive system at Farmers Castle, the settlement avoided the catastrophic fate of Big Bottom, or some of the other settlements in the area. On a more personal level, the Belpre settlers were terrified, uncertain when the next attack might come. But Israel's cabin was small and crowded at the time, sheltering 13 family members. However, Israel and Lydia had never had any intention of living there long. Israel had been granted 100 acres free in the donation tract, an area given to settlers because it lay so far from the original settlement. The government believed that offering free land would encourage settlers to build in these outlying areas, thereby creating a buffer against further Indian attacks. Israel had planned to begin clearing his donated land before his family arrived, hoping eventually to build a fine home with ample land for farming and grazing livestock. But now all of that would have to be put on hold. When morning came, the Stone family was still alive and deeply grateful. However, they remained anxious about how much longer their luck would hold. The following day, the settlers of Belpre gathered and agreed to build a garrison where they could all find safety. Within a few days, 13 blockhouses were constructed, and the families quickly moved into them. The Stones and their children were assigned the Southwest Blockhouse number 11 along with Mrs. Bathsheba Gray Dunham, the widow of Daniel Dunham. He had passed away in 1791, and she needed a safe place for her son and her two daughters. Between Blockhouse number 10 and number 11 was a long, low building, called the Barracks, in which a small detachment of U.S. troops was quartered at a later date. But crops still had to be planted and harvested, or else they would face starvation come winter. So a system was set up to protect the farmers as they went about their business. Their philosophy was a pound of prevention was worth a pound of cure, so they had built a garrison known as the Farmers' Castle under the direction of Nathan Goodale, who had made the original trip from Rutland with Israel in 1789. For the next 4 years, life remained difficult. The settlers had to cultivate their fields, staying constantly armed, and always keeping sentinels watching. It was a hard and dangerous way to live. Fortunately, no further attacks occurred near Belpre until the settlement of Newbury, 6 miles below Farmers' Castle, was hit with murderous intent. There had been 4 or 5 families living there plus 8 single men encompassing 20 souls in all. Feeling safe so close to the others, a man by the name of Brown, along with his wife and 4 children, began clearing a piece of land about 80 rods from the garrison. On March 15, 1791, his wife came out to watch him planting some fruit trees they had brought along with them. His wife, not fully apprehending any danger whatsoever from the Indians, took along her children with her. She had 1 infant in her arms, and was leading another child of 2 by the hand. With her was also Persis Dunham, daughter of Bathsheba Dunham, who was staying in Blockhouse number 11 with the Stone family. Persis was leading another child while another was loitering some distance behind them. When they joined Mr. Brown, 2 Indians sprang up, and one seized Mrs. Brown by the arm and sunk his tomahawk into her head. As she fell, the Indian struck the infant before burying his tomahawk into the child she had been leading. He pulled his knife and scalped them all. The other Indian killed Persis and the remaining child before scalping them. The wounded infant was in shock as it lay beside their dead mother. The child would recover, as did the child who had been loitering behind and was never attacked. No man, woman, or child was safe as long as the warriors were on the warpath. As word spread of the attack, alarms began to sound for everyone to head for the stockade. Israel grabbed up the younger children along with his rifle while his 2 oldest grabbed theirs. He quickly ushered everyone out of the cabin and heading for the stockade. With the Indians bearing down on them, it was then he noticed that Lydia was not among them. He immediately returned to the cabin to find Lydia straightening up the inside. He yelled, "What the hell are you doing, Lydian? They are coming." She stoically replied, "I'm not having someone come in here and see such a mess. I've always have said that human behavior never changes, only your outfit. If this story doesn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't know what does." Another family story emerged during this period as to how Israel's children viewed their lives amid these tumultuous times. Israel's 2 younger sons, Christopher Columbus and Benjamin Franklin, at 7 and 9 years old, respectively, were given the task of putting the cows in the pasture half a mile or more from the garrison. With Indians on the warpath amid their recent depredations, what mother today would have allowed their sons to travel so far from safety? However, on their way, the boys crossed a bridge over a small creek. They both possessed new pen knives, but became concerned if they were attacked by Indians, what would happen to these treasures? So, they decided it would be best to hide them under the bridge. This they did. But then they realized that if they were killed or taken prisoner, their folks would never know where to look for the knives. So, they hurried back to retrieve their prized possessions to set things right. This moment was but a small window into the daily realities of frontier life in America, demonstrating the resilience and foresight that were often required of even the youngest settlers in 1791. Also, this story vividly shows how precarious the life of Israel and Lydia had become during 1791. It shows how their hopes, fears, and the settlement's military strategy intermingled during this dangerous period of westward expansion. In the fall of that year, the family began to move back into their old cabins, but they continued to rely on their defensive structures like Farmer's Castle and their mobile surveillance forces they called spies. Then came the Governor Arthur St. Clair's and his army to save the day on November 4, 1791. He promised to eliminate the Indian problem once and for all. But when the smoke cleared, 623 soldiers lay dead in the worst loss by U.S. forces to Native Americans in American history. Veterans of the Great Battle were William Clark, of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, U.S. President William Henry Harrison, and Tecumseh, who watched his brother die in the battle. Upon the news of the defeat, terror once again spread throughout the small frontier settlement. If the Indians could wipe out an army of trained soldiers, what chance did they have? Each night, the Stones barricaded themselves into their blockhouse, and every morning, they cautiously opened their door and looked about for lurking warriors. But their survival in the face of such hardships only exemplified the resilience of the frontier settlements like Belpré, as well as the Stones' determination to survive. But the lack of direct attacks on their blockhouse didn't mean the Indian rampage was over. One constant challenge was preventing the loss of livestock of which they depended on for milk, meat, and plowing. To better protect their cows from wolves or raiders, Israel kept them on a small island in the Ohio River. But logistically, this required regular trips across the water for feeding and milking, which explained why 13-year-old Israel Jr. had to learn how to handle a canoe for his daily trips. Sadly, during a solo journey on April 25, 1791, the boy fell overboard and drowned before anyone could help. Upon recovery, he was buried in the Cedarville Cemetery in Belpré. In April of 1792, Congress finally granted the Ohio Company of Associates 100,000 acres that became known as the Donation Tract. This grant allowed the Ohio Company to offer free land to veterans who were willing to clear the land, build a cabin, and plant crops. They also had to be ready to use a rifle for defense of the community. Finally, Lydia could now see the end of her rainbow with the fine house and grazing meadow that Israel had promised her. They sat around the table in their cabin at night and talked about their sacrifices to get to this point in their lives. But, they agreed, the war with the Indians was still raging, so the fine house may have to wait for a bit. But as Israel and Lydia kept a close vigil on their family, death silently came in the back door before anyone noticed. In October 1792, Lydia became ill and passed away at 41 years old. It was a huge shock to the family, especially Israel. Lydia would now never see the fruition of their labor after so much sacrifice and hardship. But the old pioneers lived with death. It was part of their everyday lives, so they persevered. Lydia was buried in the Rainbow Cemetery, which is now called the Harmer Cemetery in Marietta. There, she was eventually joined by Israel and her children Augustus, Jasper, Sardine, and Mary. So, in 1793, Israel Stone finally received his allotted 100 acres of land in Donation Tract Allotment No. 2. With this acquisition, Israel's fortunes began to improve and a permanent home could now be built. He had acquired cows and hogs, which not only provided milk and meat for his family, but also could be traded for other commodities at the market. He had been able to purchase one ox calf in the fall of 1791, and another in 1792. It would take several years to raise and train these oxen to work as a ploughing team, but when accomplished it increased his crop's yield tenfold. His sons Jasper and Sardine also received their own 100 acres, making the Stone family the first to take up residence in the tract. But for whatever reason the tract was named Rainbow. It was then that news arrived that Jonas Davis from Rutland, the son of Daniel and Sarah, had been killed by Indians. It seemed now like it was never going to end. He had made the arduous trip in the Putnam caravan with Lydia as an assistant to the Putnam family. He was reputed to be an intelligent and highly esteemed young man. And like so many others, he had been an inmate at the Stones' blockhouse garrison in Belpre. He was engaged to be married to the daughter of Captain Isaac Barker, and had his wedding suit being prepared for the coming ceremony. Then one morning in February 1793, he was killed by the Indians near the mouth of Crooked Creek, 3 miles from the garrison. He had seen an old skiff lodged on the ice some distance up the river. Because of the scarcity of nails, he ventured out to remove any he found on the boat. When he never returned, a search was made and he was found dead, stripped and scalped, still lying on the ice. 4 of his young friends, led by John James, one of the bravest and most skillful of their number, pursued the enemy for days through the forest. At one point there was a sharp engagement, and one of the Indians was wounded. But the rifle shot brought out warriors encamped nearby, forcing James and his party to retreat. They were pursued by the Indians for several miles, but eluded them in the dark of night, and finally reached the garrison safely. There was nothing more they could do except bury Jonas in the Cedarville Cemetery in Belpre, where he rests today. The following month, tragedy struck again, when Nathan Goodale left home to work his fields on March 1, 1793. He never returned. His oxen were found still yoked, and there were moccasin prints in the snow, but no Nathan. In 1795, after the Indian Wars were over, it was discovered that he had been captured that day and was being marched to Detroit when he died of pleurisy. In response to his disappearance, the settlers had met in early spring of 1793 to discuss their future. By this time, there was a large community living at Farmer's Castle, all of which found themselves sick and tired of being cramped for room, as well as the danger and inconvenience of cultivating their lands far from their dwellings. So, they voted to divide their forces and erect 2 additional garrisons to be occupied by the families whose lands lay in the vicinity. Accordingly, one would contain 2 blockhouses built a mile below Farmer's Castle and enclosed within a palisade, and would be called Goodale's Garrison. The other would be on the bank of the Ohio 2 miles above, and was named Stone's Garrison. Construction was begun immediately on the lower one, and the assigned families moved into them that spring. The upper one contained 4 blockhouses, a schoolhouse, and several log cabins accommodating about 10 families, with the lower one only 6. As the new construction was beginning to take shape, the war was continuing to rage across Ohio unabated. It was then that General Mad Anthony Wayne's army began to assemble on the frontier. Each day the inhabitants were cheering the numerous boats that were descending the Ohio River with provisions and troops, complete with martial music that enlivened the solitary river banks of the Ohio. The troops began to relieve the people's apprehensions of future attacks from the Indians. Then on August 20, 1794, General Wayne decisively defeated the Native American Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the war was over. Ironically, Israel's eldest son, Sardine, had taken after his father and enlisted in Wayne's forces, where he took part in the pivotal battle. Veterans of the Great Battle were William Clark, of the Lewis and Clark expedition, U.S. President William Henry Harrison, and Tecumseh, who watched his brother die in the battle. That same year of 1794, Israel's son Sardine brought the first sheep ever into the Belpro community. His reasoning was that sheep not only provided meat, but also wool for making clothing and the like. In 1795, Israel brought in pear trees from seeds that he had sent to him from Massachusetts. Slowly, bit by bit, the Stone farm took shape. Israel would remarry in Washington County, Ohio, on August 28, 1796, to Mary Broadhurst Corner from Cheshire, England, the widow of William Corner, who had died in 1793 in Pennsylvania on their way west. The family had stopped over in Marietta, Ohio, and decided to stay. Here, she met Israel and they were married. Most likely Mary needed the financial help for her 7 children, so common for the day. But Israel took up this burden gladly, and made her children a great stepfather. In 1803, Belpro was host to one of America's iconic explorers, Captain Meriwether Lewis, on September 13, when he stopped over on his keelboat. Everyone turned out, including Israel and Mary, for the occasion to see the soon-to-be famous explorers that would be responsible for America's western expansion. Lewis's great expedition to the Pacific Northwest had just begun, and he was on his way to pick up his partner, Second Lieutenant William Clark. Their quest was to explore the western territories of the U.S., especially the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase, and locate a potential water route to the Pacific Ocean. The next day he traveled on to Marietta, where he sent a letter to President Thomas Jefferson about his endeavors to date. The following night he made camp above the mouth of the Little Kanawha River. On October 14, he rendezvoused at the Falls of Ohio, where Clark lived with his famous brother George Rogers Clark. And the rest is history. Prior to Israel's death in 1808, he would regularly visit his cousin, Jonathan Stone, at his house in Belpro, known as the Stone House. It was built in 1799, and was a beautiful 2-story home resting on a foundation of sandstone and covered by a metal roof. Upon his death, the house was taken over by his son, Colonel John Stone, who moved it to 612 Blennerhassett Avenue, where it remains today. Colonel Stone was a staunch abolitionist ever since he was a boy, after witnessing groups of men tracking down runaway slaves. It was a brutal practice that left an indelible impression on the young man. The Stone House still has a hidden space in the stairway where escaping slaves would be placed till they could be safely moved. Eventually, he made contact with another local well-known abolitionist, David Putnam Jr., and the two began working together with the Underground Railroad run by the famous Aunt Jenny, who is said to have been Edna Sutton. She was known as a railroad conductor, of which there were several throughout the South. Soon, the slavers across the Ohio River in West Virginia placed a bounty on his head. Because of this, he was too scared to cross the river for more than 20 years. As far as David Putnam Jr. left was concerned, he was born in 1808 in Hamar, now Marietta. His father was the first instructor at the Muskingum Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Northwest Territory. He was also the great-grandson of Major General Israel Putnam of Revolutionary War fame and the grandson of Revolutionary War Colonel Israel Putnam, who settled at Belpro. He was also a distant cousin of Brigadier General Rufus Putnam, superintendent of the Ohio Company settlement at Marietta since 1788. Both the citizens on the south side of the Ohio River, in West Virginia, and those on the north side in Ohio began developing opposing political views about slavery. Thus, the Underground Railroad and the two men began a symbiotic relationship. Watching the slaves being sold to the plantations downriver created the motivation for the two martyrs who dedicated their lives to freeing as many slaves as they could. Before the Civil War, Aunt Jenny worked as a hornblower at Parkersburg, West Virginia. There, she would blow her horn at regular intervals on foggy nights to warn riverboat captains to avoid running aground on the dangerous shoals off the point. The point was a spit of land on the north side of the confluence of the Little Kanawha and Ohio. There is no record of how many owe their lives to Colonel John Stone and David Putnam, Jr. This route, arranged by Aunt Jenny, was the main avenue into Ohio used by the Underground Railroad. The escaping slaves were told to follow the Kanawha River to Point Pleasant and from there to Parkersburg, West Virginia, where they were hidden by Aunt Jenny in a cabin on the Neal plantation. She would then use her position as a hornblower to signal through a series of bells and whistles to alert Colonel John Stone across the river that there were runaways to ferry across. She also used the freedom of her position to gather intelligence from the inhabitants of the town about the movements and plans of the slave catchers. She then passed this information to Colonel Stone. Once they were across the river in Belpro, they were hidden until they could be sent north to other destinations. Colonel Stone's home even has a room hidden at the top of a slim, steep staircase where the slaves stayed and were provided with food and drink until the next leg of their journey. In the dark of night, the runaways made their perilous journey across many a river as they inched their way north. Soon, they were able to track the activities of the slave chasers by recording their search patterns. He would hide them in his huge cornfield, then signal them when they were gone. The large field of crops was known as Stone's Bottom, where many were hidden or perhaps in one of his barns. Stone and Putnam also used bird calls to signal each other that it was now safe to move out of the Stone house before moving the runaways on to their next station on the road to freedom. Then, on the misty morning of July 11, 1804, Israel rose early for breakfast, just as he always did. The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, and the dew shimmered on the grass outside his modest home near the Ohio River. It was a day like any other, or so he thought. But that morning, far to the east, 2 shots rang out above the towering cliffs of the Palisades on the heights of Weehawken, New Jersey. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, one of the founding fathers of the United States lay dying. Alexander Hamilton, former Secretary of the Treasury, had been mortally wounded in a duel by none other than Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. It was a scandal to say the least that would shake the nation. Only 3 years earlier, Hamilton's own son, Philip, had been killed in a duel at that very spot. Now the father would follow his son, both victims of senseless violence. Dueling was outlawed in the state of New York, with severe punishment levied upon any who participated. It also was illegal in New Jersey, however the punishment was much less, so the site in New Jersey was selected. News traveled slowly to the western frontier, but by the time it reached the banks of the Ohio River, the echo of those gunshots had already begun to reshape the course of history, and it would soon reach Israel's very doorstep. Burr's political career died along with Hamilton. With his term of office ending in 1805 and his name in disgrace, Burr disappeared from the halls of power and re-emerged on the frontier. On May 5, 1805, he arrived in the small river towns of Marietta and Belpro, Ohio. To many, Burr was still a man of ambition, but to Israel, a hardened veteran of the Revolutionary War, Burr reeked of danger. He had fought and bled to rid America of tyrants. He had no intention of aiding in the making of another. Rumors began to swirl like the fog on the river. Why was Burr visiting the opulent mansion of Harmon Blennerhassett, perched on a nearby island in the Ohio River? The purpose of his visit soon became clear. He sought to use Blennerhassett Island as a base of operations for a grand, and possibly treasonous, scheme. Supplies would be stockpiled. Men would be trained. A private army would rise, all in service of some shadowy dream of conquest or secession. From the island, Burr's emissaries made trips across the river to Belpre, seeking to recruit settlers for this so-called army. Burr himself gave speeches along the waterfront, fiery and persuasive to some. But not to Israel. He stood at the edge of the crowd one afternoon, arms crossed, jaw clenched, as Burr spoke of destiny and honor. To Israel, the man sounded more like a despot in the making than a patriot. He had heard such words before, from the mouths of tyrants and kings. Soon, whispers of open rebellion reached Washington. Burr was accused of plotting to carve out a new, independent nation in the Western Territories, perhaps even to seize parts of Spanish lands. The Ohio militia, acting on orders, raided Blennerhassett's Island in search of proof. Supplies were seized, men scattered. Burr fled. In 1807, he was captured and charged with treason. The trial, one of the most sensational in American history, ended in acquittal. There was simply not enough evidence. But the damage was done. Burr's reputation was in ruins, and he fled to Europe, an exile in everything but name. Back in Belpre, Israel returned to his quiet life. But he never forgot that morning when treason drifted down the river with the mist, nor the man who had tried to raise a kingdom from the bones of a fragile republic. The year after Burr's acquittal, Private Israel Stone breathed his last in 1808. He was now laid to rest next to Lydia in the Rainbow Cemetery, now called the Harmer Cemetery in Marietta, Ohio. In 1810, his pear trees that he had planted 15 years earlier had finally begun to bear fruit, 2 years after his death. And so ended the long march of Private Israel Stone, a soldier of Saratoga, a pioneer of the frontier, and a father to a nation not yet fully born. From the blood-soaked fields of Saratoga to the unbroken wilderness of the Ohio Valley, his footsteps measured the distance between revolution and civilization. He had faced the fury of empire and the silence of the forest with the same unshakable resolve. When the musket smoke of war cleared, and the stars of a new republic began to shine, Israel turned westward, not in search of glory, but of peace. With axe and plough where once he'd borne musket and powder horn, he carved out a home among the whispering woods and restless river. There he built not just shelter, but a legacy, one that would outlive his mortal years. He had known the fire of battle and the ache of endurance. He had shaken hands with Meriwether Lewis, a maker of history, and listened to the madman Aaron Burr who sought to reshape a fledgling country. His life was the living chronicle of America's becoming, a bridge between the old world's tyranny and the untamed promise of the new. In the twilight of his years, when his hands grew still and his heart at last found rest, the land he had tamed carried his memory in the very wind that swept across the valley. His name, etched not in marble, but in his bloodline that has endured for generations. For though the soldier is now gone, his spirit remains, undaunted, unflinching, and unquestioning. Here lies his story, preserved in literary form, that will give voice to the unyielding echo of Israel Stone.